He noticed the signal before anyone else did, not because it was stronger, but because it didn't behave the way it was supposed to. In a system built to filter noise, this one detail was dismissed as interference. But to him, it felt structured, intentional, repeating, almost like something hiding in plain sight. Around him, procedures moved forward exactly as trained, checklists completed, engines prepared, decisions already made before the aircraft ever left the ground. No one questioned the data, because the system had already decided what mattered. He sat there, staring at a pattern no one had taught him to recognize, realizing that if he was right, they weren't about to hunt anything at all. They were about to fly directly into something that had already predicted where they would be. And the only thing more dangerous than being wrong was being ignored. If this kind of hidden moment intrigues you, hit like and subscribe, because what happened next didn't just change one mission. It quietly changed how an entire war was fought. Before the war, this skill had no military value, and that was precisely why no one had designed a doctrine around it. Skelton had not been trained to fight aircraft. He had been trained, almost accidentally, to notice when something repeated just enough to stop being random, and just irregular enough to avoid being predictable. In civilian life, that kind of attention drifted toward radio signals, mechanical rhythms, the way interference patterns formed when two frequencies overlapped, subtle differences that most people filtered out because they seemed irrelevant. Inside the RAF, however, relevance was defined by procedure, and procedure reduced everything into categories that could be acted upon quickly, which meant anything that didn't fit those categories was discarded before it could slow anyone down. The serrate system itself reflected that mindset, a piece of equipment designed to detect emissions from German airborne radar, giving bearings without clear distance, a tool meant to support interception rather than redefine it. Most operators treated it exactly that way, watching for signals, calling directions, feeding information into a chain of decisions that had already been standardized. Skelton did something slightly different. Something small enough that no one would have written it into a manual. He listened to how the signal behaved over time instead of just where it pointed. That difference was subtle, almost invisible in a training environment, because training focused on outcomes, not interpretation, and outcomes required speed more than nuance. Yet in practice, those signals carried more than location. They carried habits, and habits formed patterns, and patterns revealed systems. What unsettled him that night was not that he detected activity, but that the activity aligned too neatly across multiple bearings, as if independent aircraft were following a shared logic rather than acting individually. To most crews, multiple contacts meant increased threat, a higher chance of engagement, a more dangerous sky. To Skelton, it suggested something else entirely. That the German night fighters were not scattered hunters, but components of a coordinated structure that depended on predictability to function. The system around him did not have a category for that interpretation, because it assumed the enemy reacted rather than organized, and so his observation existed in a kind of operational blind spot, acknowledged but not acted upon. He understood that if he framed it incorrectly, it would be dismissed as overthinking, an unnecessary complication in a situation where clarity was valued above all else. At the same time, ignoring it meant continuing to operate under assumptions that no longer matched reality. This was where the tension began to shift from the external threat to something far more difficult to confront, the possibility that the system designed to keep them effective was also preventing them from seeing what was actually happening. The aircraft they were about to fly, the de Havilland Mosquito, was itself a contradiction of expectations. Built from wood when most believed metal defined strength, designed for speed rather than heavy armament, proving that performance could come from rejecting established norms. Yet, even inside that aircraft, the thinking remained constrained by procedures that prioritized consistency over reinterpretation. Skelton sat with that contradiction as the engines were prepared, aware that his role officially ended at providing information, not redefining its meaning. Still, the signal remained, repeating just enough to suggest intent, shifting just enough to resist classification, and he found himself mapping it mentally against movement, imagining how multiple aircraft would need to position themselves to produce what he was seeing. It formed a loose geometry in his mind, not precise but structured, something that could only exist if each part followed rules that none of them individually controlled. That realization carried an implication he could not ignore. If the system relied on predictable positioning, then entering it at the right point would not trigger immediate detection, because nothing in it was designed to recognize what did not belong. The idea did not feel like a tactic. It felt like a consequence of understanding how the structure operated. And that was the problem, because consequences like that had no place in a system that required deliberate planning, not spontaneous reinterpretation. He knew that once they were airborne, decisions would need to be made quickly. And there would be no time to argue theory, no framework to justify acting on something that could not be measured in the way others expected. Yet the more he considered it, the clearer it became that the risk was not only in acting on his interpretation, but in failing to act at all, because continuing to follow established procedures would place them exactly where the opposing system expected them to be. In that sense, the danger was no longer defined by enemy capability, but by the predictability of their own behavior, and for the first time, Skelton began to understand that the advantage did not come from better weapons or faster aircraft, but from recognizing when a system had become so consistent that it could be entered without resistance. Once they were over the continent, the signal began to behave in a way that confirmed what Skelton had only suspected before takeoff. It did not drift randomly across the receiver, nor did it fade in and out like isolated transmissions searching blindly for targets. Instead, it appeared, strengthened, shifted, then reappeared in intervals that felt measured rather than accidental, as if each emission was part of a larger rhythm controlled by something beyond a single aircraft. He tracked it without announcing anything unusual at first, adjusting bearings in the expected cadence, allowing the process to unfold long enough to test whether what he was seeing would hold. The first contact resolved into a clear direction, and Burbridge moved accordingly. The aircraft responding smoothly, engine steady, everything operating within normal parameters, yet normal was exactly what unsettled Skelton now, because the signal did not behave like an isolated presence. It aligned with another faint return further off, then another, forming a loose chain that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. What others would have treated as separate threats began to merge into something structured in his mind, each emission marking a position that made sense only if the aircraft producing them were arranged with intention. He began mapping it silently, estimating relative spacing not by distance but by timing, measuring how long it took for one signal to strengthen after another weakened, building a moving diagram that existed only in his interpretation. The closer they moved, the more consistent the pattern became, reinforcing the idea that this was not a collection of independent hunters, but a system maintaining its own internal order. When the first aircraft finally came into visual range, it confirmed part of what he expected and contradicted another. It was exactly where the pattern suggested it would be, holding a course that fit the geometry he had imagined. Yet it behaved as if unaware of anything outside its assigned role, scanning forward, committed to a search that did not account for observation from behind. Burbridge positioned the Mosquito carefully, following instructions delivered in steady increments, and within moments the engagement unfolded with precision, brief and controlled. The outcome determined almost as soon as it began. But the result itself was not what held Skelton's attention. It was what remained afterward. The disappearance of that single aircraft did not disrupt the broader pattern the way he might have expected if each unit operated independently. The other signals continued, adjusting slightly but not collapsing, maintaining the same general structure with minimal deviation. That continuity suggested resilience, but also rigidity, a system capable of absorbing loss without immediately recognizing the source of disruption. It implied that each part trusted the overall structure more than its own awareness, continuing to function even when something within it had already changed. As they moved again, a second contact emerged along a line that mirrored the first, reinforcing the idea that positions were not chosen randomly, but assigned according to a shared framework. Skelton followed it with the same method, watching not just where it appeared, but how it related to everything else. And once again, the aircraft resolved exactly where the pattern predicted, repeating the same behavior, scanning ahead, committed to a direction that made sense only within its own limited perspective. The engagement that followed was equally efficient, but again, the broader structure persisted, adjusting just enough to maintain coverage without revealing any awareness of intrusion. At that point, the realization shifted from observation to implication. If individual aircraft could be removed without triggering immediate recognition across the system, then the system itself was operating on delayed awareness. Relying on external coordination rather than real-time perception, that meant there existed a window, small but consistent, where an element that did not belong could occupy space within that structure without being identified as foreign. The idea was no longer theoretical. It had been demonstrated twice, not through intention, but through the system's own behavior. Skelton understood then that the danger was not in approaching these aircraft directly, but in failing to recognize that they were part of something that could be entered, not just attacked. Each movement they made either aligned with that structure or disrupted it, and so far, their actions had been interpreted as isolated events rather than signs of infiltration. That distinction mattered, because it defined how the system would respond, and as long as it continued to interpret events incorrectly, it would remain vulnerable in ways it was not designed to detect. The pattern was no longer something to observe. It had become something that could be used. If someone was willing to act on an understanding that had never been formally acknowledged, the moment he chose to speak, the risk shifted from interpretation to consequence. Skelton did not frame it as a tactic, because there was no approved language for what he was about to suggest, and anything that sounded uncertain would be dismissed before it could be tested. Instead, he described the structure as if it were already accepted, outlining positions, relative spacing, and movement, as though he were reading from something documented rather than inferred. Burbridge listened without interrupting, not because the idea sounded safe, but because it was internally consistent, and consistency was often the only indicator that something might be real even when it defied expectation. What Skelton proposed was simple in wording and unacceptable in implication. Do not break away, do not reposition for a clean attack, and do not treat each contact as a separate engagement. Instead, match the structure, adjust speed and heading gradually, and enter the space between them as if they belonged there. It was the kind of suggestion that did not fail dramatically. It failed quietly, leaving no time to correct it if it was wrong. The doctrine they had trained under emphasized separation, clarity, and controlled interception, all based on the assumption that proximity increased risk. Skelton's reasoning inverted that assumption entirely, suggesting that proximity, if understood correctly, might actually reduce detection, because the system was not built to evaluate what existed within its own arrangement. The tension inside the cockpit did not come from immediate danger, but from the absence of any precedent to support what they were about to attempt. Burbridge's hesitation was not about fear of the enemy, but about stepping outside a framework that had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of improvisation. Yet the pattern Skelton had described continued to hold, each signal reinforcing the geometry he had outlined, each movement aligning with a structure that seemed to operate independently of any awareness of intrusion. Rejecting the idea would mean returning to a method that treated each contact in isolation, a method that now appeared incomplete given what they had observed. Accepting it meant trusting an interpretation that could not be verified until it was already too late to reverse. That was the true weight of the decision, not whether it would succeed, but whether it deserved to be attempted at all. Burbridge made the adjustment without announcing it, easing the aircraft into alignment rather than committing abruptly, allowing the transition to occur in a way that would not draw attention even if the system could perceive it. The Mosquito's speed and control made the movement possible, but it was not the aircraft that created the opportunity. It was the decision to reinterpret what the system allowed. As they moved into position, the expected response never came, No sudden change in signal behavior, no indication that they had been recognized as something outside the pattern. The structure remained intact, continuing its rotation, each element maintaining its assigned role. And for a brief moment, the absence of reaction confirmed something far more significant than any engagement could have. The system did not just fail to detect them. It had no mechanism to question their presence. That realization carried a different kind of tension, one that replaced uncertainty with responsibility. Because once it became clear that the structure could be entered, every action taken within it would carry consequences beyond the immediate situation. This was no longer about a single engagement or even a single mission. It was about altering how interactions between these systems would unfold from that point forward. Skelton understood that the decision they had just made would not remain isolated, because if it worked once, it would be repeated, and repetition would transform it from an anomaly into a method. The question was no longer whether the idea was valid, but what it would set in motion if it proved effective. For several seconds, the system held together as if nothing had changed, and that absence of reaction carried more weight than any immediate confrontation. The aircraft ahead maintained its spacing, the one behind adjusted slightly to preserve distance, and the signals continued their measured rhythm, each element behaving exactly as it had before, as though the intrusion had been accepted as part of the structure rather than identified as an anomaly. Skelton monitored the alignment carefully, not looking for confirmation in the form of detection, but for subtle deviations that would indicate awareness, a shift in timing, a break in the sequence, anything that suggested the system had begun to question itself. Nothing came. Instead, the pattern absorbed their presence without resistance, continuing its rotation with a consistency that revealed its greatest weakness. It depended on expectation, not verification. That distinction meant every unit within it trusted the arrangement more than its own perception, operating under the assumption that anything occupying a valid position must belong there. Within that assumption, Skelton saw the opening not as an opportunity for immediate action, but as a condition that could be extended, prolonged just enough to allow controlled intervention, without triggering a systemic response. Burbridge followed the incremental adjustments with precision, maintaining speed and distance in a way that avoided drawing attention, each movement calculated to remain within the tolerance of the structure's expectations. The tension was no longer about whether they would be engaged, but about how long the system would continue to accept their presence, before the accumulation of small inconsistencies forced it to react. When the first engagement occurred within this arrangement, it was executed with restraint, brief and deliberate, designed to minimize disruption rather than maximize immediate effect. The targeted aircraft dropped out of position, its signal fading rapidly, yet the surrounding elements did not collapse or scatter in response. Instead, they compensated, adjusting spacing, re-establishing the pattern with minimal deviation, as if the loss had been anticipated as a possibility but not analyzed as a cause. That response confirmed what Skelton had begun to understand. The system was built to maintain function, not to investigate anomalies in real time. Each action taken within it was interpreted as part of its normal operation. Even when that action originated from outside its design, this created a delay between cause and recognition, a gap that could be used again if approached carefully. The second intervention followed the same principle, not as repetition, but as continuation, testing whether the system's tolerance would hold under multiple disruptions. Once again, the structure adjusted rather than collapsed, redistributing its elements to preserve coverage, reinforcing the idea that it prioritized continuity over awareness. At that point, the implications extended beyond the immediate situation. If the system could absorb sequential losses without identifying their source, then it could be influenced from within in a way that would never be possible through direct confrontation. The effect was not immediate destruction, but gradual destabilization, a process in which each action altered the system's internal balance without triggering a unified response. Skelton recognized that what they were doing was not simply engaging individual aircraft, but interacting with a structure that interpreted their presence incorrectly at every stage. That misinterpretation compounded over time. Each adjustment made by the system reinforcing the conditions that allowed the next intervention to occur. The danger in that realization was not in the act itself, but in its scalability. What worked in this instance could be repeated by others, and repetition would transform a singular event into a pattern of its own, one that the opposing system would not immediately recognize as external influence. Burbridge maintained control throughout, not as an aggressive force, but as a stabilizing element within an environment that had not yet acknowledged his existence as a threat. The aircraft responded as expected, engines steady, controls precise. Yet the outcome was being shaped less by physical capability than by the interpretation guiding each decision. As the sequence continued, the structure began to show signs of strain, not through sudden breakdown, but through subtle inconsistencies, spacing that required correction, timing that no longer aligned perfectly, indications that the system was compensating more frequently than before. These were not reactions to a visible opponent, but to internal discrepancies it could not fully resolve. The effect resembled a chain reaction that progressed without a single identifiable starting point, each adjustment leading to another, each correction introducing a new imbalance. Skelton understood then that the most significant change was not the removal of individual elements, but the shift in how the system functioned as a whole. It had been forced into a state where maintaining its structure required constant correction, reducing its ability to operate as originally intended. That shift would not end with this encounter, because the underlying vulnerability had been exposed, and exposure meant it could be exploited again. The consequence of their decision was already extending beyond the immediate environment, setting conditions that would influence how future interactions unfolded, not through force, but through the continued application of understanding in a system that had not been designed to account for it. By the time they turned back toward friendly airspace, the outcome of the mission had already begun to detach from the mission itself. What had happened in the sky could be described in terms of positions, movements, and engagements. But those descriptions would never fully capture what had actually changed. Skelton understood this before they even crossed the coastline, because the most important part of what they had done could not be recorded as a standard report. It was not a sequence of actions. It was a shift in interpretation. When they landed and the routine process of documentation began, everything was reduced into categories that made sense within existing frameworks. Context detected, courses adjusted, engagements completed, results observed. The language was precise, structured, and entirely insufficient. The intelligence officer assigned to review the report approached it the same way he approached every other account, looking for consistency, clarity, and alignment with known procedures. At first, nothing appeared unusual. The sequence was coherent, the outcomes plausible, the details aligned with what could be expected from a successful mission, yet something did not fit: the spacing of events, the timing between contacts, the way multiple interactions occurred within a confined area without triggering a broader response. All of it suggested a level of access that should not have been possible under the assumptions the system relied on. The officer reread the report, not because it was unclear, but because it was too consistent in a way that implied a different kind of logic beneath it. He attempted to map the described movements onto established doctrine, but the alignment failed. The actions made sense individually, but together they formed a pattern that had no place in the framework he was using to evaluate them. That disconnect was not immediately recognized as a breakthrough. It was treated as an anomaly, something that required clarification rather than redefinition. Questions were raised, not about what had been done, but about how it had been interpreted. Skelton's explanations did not rely on technical innovation or new equipment. They focused on how existing signals had been understood differently, how timing and structure revealed relationships that standard procedures did not account for. This was difficult to accept, not because it was incorrect, but because it implied that the system had been operating with an incomplete understanding of its own tools. Accepting that would mean acknowledging that the advantage did not come from superior technology alone, but from the way information was processed by individuals within the system. As the analysis continued, the implications began to extend beyond the single mission. If the described approach could be repeated, then it represented a method of interaction that bypassed the assumptions both sides had been operating under. For the RAF, it suggested that interception did not need to occur at the edges of enemy activity. It could occur within it. For the Luftwaffe, though they did not yet realize it, it introduced a vulnerability that forced a choice between two incompatible requirements: use radar and risk revealing position, or limit its use and reduce effectiveness. This was the beginning of a shift that would not be visible immediately, because systems do not change in response to a single event. They change when that event is recognized, repeated, and incorporated into practice. Within days, elements of the approach began to circulate, not as a fully understood doctrine, but as a set of observations that challenged existing assumptions. Crews were briefed differently, not told to replicate a specific action, but encouraged to reconsider how they interpreted the signals they received. The change was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable in its early stages, but its effects accumulated. Enemy formations that once operated with confidence began to experience inconsistencies they could not easily explain. Interceptions occurred in places that had previously been considered secure. The balance shifted, not through overwhelming force, but through a gradual erosion of predictability. What had started as a single decision made under uncertainty began to propagate through the system, influencing outcomes far beyond its original context. Skelton observed this development with a level of detachment that came from understanding how it had begun. The decision itself had not been made to change the war. It had been made to resolve a contradiction in the information he was seeing. Yet once that contradiction was addressed, the effects extended outward, altering the conditions under which future decisions would be made. This was the nature of the domino effect. Not a dramatic collapse, but a sequence of adjustments, each one building on the last, until the system no longer functioned in the way it had before. The intelligence officer eventually documented the findings in terms that could be integrated into existing structures, but even then, the core insight remained difficult to formalize. It was not a procedure that could be followed step by step. It was a way of seeing that required interpretation, judgment, and a willingness to question what had previously been accepted as sufficient. That requirement limited how widely it could be applied, because not everyone would recognize the same patterns, and not every situation would present the same opportunities. Still, the shift had occurred, and once a system changes, it cannot return to its previous state without ignoring what has been learned. The consequences of that change would continue to unfold, influencing decisions on both sides, forcing adaptations that neither had initially planned for. Years later, when the noise of the war had faded into something quieter and more distant, the details that remained were not the ones most people expected. There were no repeated descriptions of precision or speed, no emphasis on how many engagements had taken place or how effectively they had been carried out. What stayed with both men was something less visible, something that did not translate easily into stories told after the fact. They had not set out to prove a theory or to redefine a method. They had simply followed an interpretation to its logical conclusion, and that conclusion had extended far beyond the moment in which it was made. After leaving service, both moved into lives that seemed deliberately removed from the systems they had once operated within, choosing paths that focused on guidance, reflection, and meaning rather than control or efficiency. That shift was not an attempt to erase what had happened, but to place it in a context where its significance could be considered without the urgency that had once surrounded it. When asked about that period, they did not describe it in terms of success or failure, because neither of those categories fully captured what they had experienced. The decision that defined that night had not been about defeating an opponent. It had been about recognizing that a system could be understood differently, and that acting on that understanding would produce consequences no one involved could fully predict at the time. Over the years, those consequences became clearer in some ways and more complex in others. The method that emerged from that moment was adopted, adapted, and integrated into broader practices, influencing how similar situations were approached long after the original context had passed. It contributed to shifts in effectiveness, altered expectations, and changed how both sides evaluated risk. But it also raised questions that did not have straightforward answers. If a system can be entered because it relies on assumptions it does not question, then any improvement in understanding becomes a form of leverage, and leverage, once applied, reshapes outcomes, whether or not that was the original intention. This introduces a form of responsibility that extends beyond the immediate decision. Because the effects do not remain contained, they propagate, influencing events that unfold later, in different places, involving people who had no connection to the initial moment. Skelton understood that what he had done was not unique in principle, even if it was rare in practice. The ability to see patterns where others saw noise exists in many contexts, but the choice to act on that perception within a system that does not recognize it is what creates change. That choice is never neutral. It alters not only what happens next, but how future decisions are made by others who observe the results without fully understanding the reasoning behind them. Burbridge, for his part, carried a different aspect of the same experience. The realization that execution alone does not define outcome. It is the interpretation guiding that execution that determines what becomes possible. Without that interpretation, the same actions would have produced entirely different results, fitting neatly into existing expectations rather than reshaping them. Together, their experience reflected something that extended beyond the specifics of that night, pointing to a broader principle about how systems function and how they fail. Systems are built to manage complexity by reducing it into predictable forms, and in doing so, they inevitably exclude possibilities that do not fit those forms. When someone recognizes one of those excluded possibilities and acts on it, the system does not immediately adapt. It continues to operate as designed until the accumulated effects force a change. By the time that change occurs, the original action has already moved beyond its initial context, becoming part of a chain of events that no longer depends on the person who initiated it. That is where the question remains, not resolved, but persistent. If a single decision, based on a different way of understanding, can alter the conditions of a conflict and affect outcomes far removed from its origin, then how should that decision be judged? Is it defined by the immediate intent, the broader consequences, or something in between that cannot be measured in simple terms? There is no definitive answer offered here, because the situation itself does not provide one. What it does offer is a way of thinking about influence that goes beyond visible action. The most significant changes are not always the ones that draw attention. They are often the ones that occur when someone recognizes a pattern others have ignored and chooses to act on it, despite the absence of validation. That kind of decision does not rely on force, and it does not guarantee a particular outcome, but it does carry the potential to reshape how a system behaves. The lesson, if there is one, is not about control or dominance, but about awareness and responsibility. Understanding a system gives you the ability to change it, but it also places you in a position where the consequences of that change extend further than you can see. Whether those consequences are considered beneficial or harmful depends on perspectives that exist beyond the moment of decision. What remains certain is that once a system has been understood in a new way, it cannot return to being unseen, and the choice to act on that understanding becomes part of a larger sequence that continues long after the original context has disappeared.